The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's flagship, the aircraft carrier Akagi, as dawn broke on June 4, 1942. 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor transformed America from a sleeping giant into a vengeful colossus, and now Japanese resolve would be tested against American steel in waters that would determine the fate of nations. Nagumo stood on the bridge, his weathered face betraying none of the anxiety that gnawed at his stomach. Behind him, the largest naval armada Japan had ever assembled, cut through the dark waters toward a tiny atoll called Midway. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, formed the spearhead of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's masterpiece, a plan designed to lure the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle and destroy it once and for all. The strategy was elegant in its complexity. While Nagumo's carrier force would pummel Midway's defenses, a massive invasion fleet would seize the island. Meanwhile, Admiral Yamamoto himself would command the main battle fleet from his flagship Yamato, ready to annihilate any American ships foolish enough to challenge Japanese supremacy. It was a trap worthy of the samurai code that still burned in Japanese hearts. But 3,000 miles away in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz held a secret that would shatter Japanese dreams like cherry blossoms in a typhoon. American codebreakers had cracked the Japanese naval cipher, giving Nimitz unprecedented insight into Yamamoto's plans. The trap was known, and the hunters had become the hunted. Captain Joseph Rochefort, the brilliant cryptanalyst who had unlocked Japan's secrets, worked tirelessly in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters. His team's intercepts revealed not just the target, Midway, but the timing, the forces involved, and even the radio call signs. According to historical accounts from the National Security Agency's declassified documents, Rochefort's intelligence coup gave America its greatest advantage since the war began. Nimitz faced an agonizing decision. His fleet was outnumbered and outgunned, with only 3 operational carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, against Nagumo's 4. But he possessed something more valuable than ships: knowledge of his enemy's intentions. Meanwhile, Admiral gathered his commanders in his Pearl Harbor office, spreading charts across the mahogany table where America's Pacific strategy would be forged. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance would command Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet, while Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher led Task Force 17 centered on Yorktown. These men would carry the weight of American hopes into battle. As the American fleet sortied from Pearl Harbor on May 28th, sailors lined the rails of their ships, many realizing they might never see Hawaii again. The burden of democracy itself sailed with them toward a rendezvous with destiny, at coordinates that would be seared into history's memory. Commander Wade McCluskey adjusted his flight goggles aboard Enterprise, leading Squadron 6's dive bombers in final preparations. These pilots, many barely old enough to vote, would soon hold the fate of nations in their hands as they plunged from the sky toward Japanese flight decks. The stage was set for the most pivotal naval battle in Pacific history, where Japanese resolve would indeed meet American steel in a contest that would echo through generations. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942, shrouded the Pacific in an eerie calm that belied the storm about to break. Aboard the Japanese carrier Akagi, Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the same pilot who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, prepared his aircrew for what they believed would be another glorious victory for the Emperor. At precisely 4:30 in the morning, Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft roared from the decks of his carriers, their engines creating a thunderous symphony that announced Japan's intentions to the sleeping Pacific. Fuchida watched his comrades disappear into the gray dawn, confident that American resistance would crumble before Japanese superiority. But 240 miles northeast of Midway, Admiral Fletcher aboard Yorktown had already received the intelligence he needed. American PBY Catalina flying boats, prowling the ocean since before sunrise, spotted the Japanese fleet at 5:30. The radio crackled with the electrifying message that would change everything. Enemy carriers bearing 320 distance, 180. The news reached every American ship within minutes. On Enterprise, Admiral Spruance made the decision that would define his legacy. Rather than wait for the Japanese to complete their attack on Midway, He would launch immediately, catching Nagumo's carriers while their decks were cluttered with refueling and rearming aircraft. At Midway itself, the Japanese attack met fierce resistance that surprised Nagumo's pilots. Marine fighter pilots, flying obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats, threw themselves against the superior Japanese Zeros with suicidal courage. Major Floyd Parks led Marine Fighter Squadron 221 in a desperate defense that cost 23 American aircraft, but bought precious time. The island's anti-aircraft guns, manned by Marines who had been preparing for this moment for months, filled the sky with deadly bursts of flak. Despite overwhelming odds, Midway's defenders inflicted enough damage to force Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, leading the Japanese attack, to radio back a message that would seal his fleet's doom. There is need for a second attack wave. Nagumo faced a commander's nightmare. His first strike had failed to neutralize Midway completely, but intelligence reports suggested American ships were approaching. Should he rearm his remaining aircraft for a second attack on the island, or prepare for naval combat? The decision would haunt him for the rest of his short life, as mechanics frantically switched ordnance on the Japanese carriers, replacing armor-piercing bombs with high-explosive weapons for land targets. American torpedo bombers were already approaching. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, pressed forward in obsolete Douglas Devastator aircraft that had become flying coffins. Historical records from the Naval History and Heritage Command reveal the extraordinary courage of these early American attacks. Waldron's entire squadron was shot down, with only Ensign George Gay surviving to witness the battle from his life raft. Similar fates befell torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown, with 41 of 42 torpedo bombers lost in futile attacks, but their sacrifice served a crucial purpose. The low-level torpedo attacks forced Japanese fighter planes down to wave-top height, leaving the sky clear for the dive bombers that would soon appear. As Gay floated in the Pacific, watching Japanese sailors celebrate what they thought was victory, he had no idea that American dive bombers were already beginning their deadly approach from 20,000 feet above. The morning's carnage had only begun, and Japanese resolve was about to meet American steel in its most devastating form. At 10:24 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 37 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise into a power dive that would reshape the Pacific War. 20,000 feet below, the Japanese carriers Akagi and Kaga steamed in formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being hastily rearmed for another strike against Midway. McCluskey had nearly missed his target entirely. Flying southwest from Enterprise, his squadron had found empty ocean where intelligence reports placed the Japanese fleet. Fuel gauges showed dangerously low levels, and several pilots had already turned back, but McCluskey pressed on, following a Japanese destroyer racing northward, a decision that placed him directly above Nagumo's carriers at the most vulnerable moment possible. The scene below was one of organized chaos. Japanese mechanics worked frantically to switch ordnance on dozens of aircraft, while others refueled planes that had returned from the Midway strike. Bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines created a deadly tinderbox across the carrier decks. Admiral Nagumo, still debating whether to launch another land attack or prepare for naval combat, had created the perfect conditions for catastrophe. "Attack! Attack!" McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio as his dive bombers screamed earthward. The dauntless aircraft, ungainly in level flight but deadly in their diving attack, plunged toward the Japanese carriers at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from every ship in the Japanese formation, filling the sky with black bursts of flak and tracer rounds. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led 17 more dive bombers from Yorktown against the carrier Soryu. The timing was perfect. All three Japanese carriers came under attack within minutes of each other, overwhelming their defenses and preventing coordinated response. The first bomb struck Akagi's flight deck at 10:26, penetrating to the hangar deck below where it detonated among fueled and armed aircraft. The explosion triggered a chain reaction of secondary blasts that transformed Japan's flagship carrier into a floating inferno. Admiral Nagumo, thrown to his knees by the concussion, watched in horror as his proud ship began its death throes. On Kaga, Lieutenant Dick Best's bomb struck directly amidships, igniting aviation fuel that spread liquid fire across the carrier's length. Within minutes, both ships were blazing wrecks, their crews fighting desperate battles against flames that defied every attempt at control. The acrid smoke rising from the burning carriers could be seen for 50 miles across the Pacific. According to detailed accounts preserved in the U.S. Naval Institute's archives, the attacks on all three carriers occurred within a span of just 5 minutes, from 10:24 to 10:29. In that brief window, the entire balance of Pacific naval power shifted from Japan to America. Soryuz suffered equally devastating damage from Yorktown's dive bombers. Lieutenant Commander Leslie's aircraft methodically planted bombs along the carrier's flight deck, each explosion adding to the growing conflagration. Captain Yanagimoto, Soryuz's commanding officer, chose to go down with his ship rather than abandon the vessel that had served him faithfully since before Pearl Harbor. The human cost was staggering. Hundreds of Japanese sailors trapped below decks by twisted metal and spreading fires faced agonizing deaths. Others leaped into the oil-slicked Pacific, choosing drowning over burning. The proud pilots who had conquered much of the Pacific found themselves swimming for their lives amid the debris of their shattered air groups. Only Hiryu remained operational of Nagumo's 4 carriers, and Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi wasted no time in launching a counterattack. His remaining aircraft would soon discover that American steel could absorb punishment as well as deliver it, but the decisive moment had already passed. Japanese resolve had met its match in American determination and superior intelligence. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi stood on Hiryu's bridge at 11:30 on June 4th, watching smoke columns from 3 burning Japanese carriers stain the Pacific horizon. As the sole surviving carrier commander in Nagumo's shattered fleet, he faced a decision that would determine whether Japan could salvage anything from the disaster unfolding around him. Yamaguchi was no ordinary officer. Considered one of Japan's most aggressive and capable admirals, he had advocated for the Pearl Harbor attack and commanded carrier operations throughout the Pacific campaign. Now, with his nation's naval supremacy hanging by a thread, he prepared to launch every available aircraft in a desperate counterattack. At 12:45, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters roared from Hiryu's deck, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. Their target was the American carrier force that had inflicted such devastating losses on the Japanese fleet. Intelligence from reconnaissance aircraft had located the enemy ships, and Yamaguchi was determined to exact revenge for his fallen comrades. Meanwhile, Admiral Fletcher aboard Yorktown had no illusions about Japanese capabilities. Despite the morning's spectacular success, he knew that at least one enemy carrier remained operational. The veteran admiral, who had commanded American forces at Coral Sea just a month earlier, prepared his ship for the inevitable counterattack. Yorktown's combat air patrol spotted the incoming Japanese formation at 2 o'clock, but only 6 Wildcat fighters remained airborne to intercept 18 enemy dive bombers. The mathematics of aerial combat favored the attackers, and Lieutenant Kobayashi pressed his advantage with the skill that had made Japanese naval aviation legendary. The attack began at 2:10 with Yorktown taking evasive action, her helmsman throwing the 20,000-ton carrier into sharp turns that sent waves cascading across her flight deck. Anti-aircraft guns from the entire task force filled the sky with deadly bursts, but Japanese pilots, trained since childhood in the warrior traditions of Bushido, ignored the flak and pressed their attacks home. 3 bombs struck Yorktown within minutes. The first penetrated the flight deck near the island superstructure, killing dozens of sailors and starting fires that threatened the ship's ammunition storage. The second hit amidships, rupturing fuel lines and causing significant flooding. The third bomb struck the carrier's uptakes, reducing her speed and filling her interior with choking smoke. But Yorktown's damage control teams, trained by months of hard experience in the Pacific, worked miracles that amazed even veteran sailors. Chief Carpenter Claude Ricketts led firefighting efforts that contained the blazes within 30 minutes. Repair crews patched holes in the flight deck with steel plates, while engineers restored power to critical systems. By 3 o'clock, Yorktown was recovering aircraft and preparing to resume flight operations. The sight of the apparently undamaged American carrier stunned Japanese reconnaissance pilots when they returned that afternoon. According to historical accounts from the Naval War College, Japanese aircrew reported attacking 2 different American carriers, not realizing that Yorktown's crew had performed what appeared to be impossible repairs. At 4:24, Yamaguchi launched his second and final strike. 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters under Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same pilot who had led the morning attack on Midway. This time, the Japanese would not be denied their target. Tominaga's attack achieved what many thought impossible, putting 2 torpedoes into Yorktown's port side that caused severe flooding and a dangerous list. The carrier's power failed completely, leaving her dead in the water and apparently doomed. Admiral Fletcher, recognizing that his flagship could no longer operate aircraft effectively, transferred his flag to the cruiser Astoria and continued the battle from there. But even as Yorktown fought for survival, American dive bombers were preparing to eliminate the last Japanese carrier. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably, and Japanese resolve would soon meet its final test against American steel. At 5 o'clock on the afternoon of June 4, 1942, Admiral Taman Yamaguchi stood alone on Hiryu's bridge, watching his pilots return from their second attack on the American fleet. Only 5 aircraft remained from the 18 that had departed 2 hours earlier, their pilots reporting that the enemy carrier, which they believed to be a second ship, was burning and listing heavily. Yamaguchi allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. His counterattacks had damaged and possibly sunk an American carrier, but the cost had been devastating. Of the 108 aircraft that had taken off from his 4 carriers that morning, fewer than a dozen remained operational. The cream of Japanese naval aviation lay scattered across the Pacific floor or burned in the wreckage of 3 carriers. But the Admiral's brief respite ended when lookouts spotted aircraft approaching from the northeast. At 5:26:24, American dive bombers from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher, began their attack approach on the last Japanese carrier. Spruance had found his target, and American steel was about to deliver its final blow. Hiryu's anti-aircraft guns opened fire with desperate intensity, their crews knowing that their ship represented Japan's last hope in the Pacific. But the American pilots, emboldened by their morning success and flying aircraft specifically designed for this type of attack, pressed forward through the barrage with methodical precision. 4 bombs struck Hiryu within minutes. The first penetrated her flight deck forward, igniting aviation fuel that spread liquid fire throughout the hangar spaces below. The second hit near the island, destroying the ship's primary fire control systems and killing dozens of crew members. The third and fourth bombs, striking in rapid succession, sealed the carrier's fate by rupturing her hull and causing catastrophic flooding. Admiral Yamaguchi faced the same decision that had confronted his fellow commanders throughout the day: abandon ship or die with honor. Unlike his colleagues who had transferred to other vessels, Yamaguchi chose the path of Bushido. Standing on his burning bridge, he composed a final message to Admiral Yamamoto. "We have lost all our aircraft. We are preparing to burn and sink. We fought bravely." The human drama unfolding aboard the dying carrier reflected the broader tragedy of Japanese naval aviation. Petty Officer Kiyoshi Ogawa, a veteran pilot who had participated in attacks from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea, helped rescue wounded shipmates from the blazing hangar deck before the spreading fires made further efforts impossible. His sacrifice, repeated by hundreds of others, demonstrated that Japanese resolve remained unbroken even in defeat. As Hiryu burned through the night, Admiral Yamamoto aboard his flagship Yamato faced the most difficult decision of his career. Historical records from Japan's defense ministry reveal that Yamamoto seriously considered bringing his main battle fleet forward to engage the Americans in a night surface action. The massive battleships under his command, led by the 18-inch gun, Yamato could potentially destroy the American carriers if they could close to fighting range. But reality intruded on Japanese hopes. Spruance had wisely withdrawn his carriers eastward, avoiding the night engagement that might have reversed the day's verdict. American submarines patrolled the approaches to Midway, while land-based aircraft from the atoll stood ready to attack any Japanese ships that ventured within range. The window for Japanese victory had closed with the setting sun. At 2:30 on the morning of June 5th, Admiral Yamaguchi gave his final order: abandon ship. But true to the samurai code that had guided his life, he remained aboard Hiryu as she settled deeper into the Pacific. Captain Tomeo Kaku joined his admiral in choosing death over dishonor, and both men were last seen standing on the bridge as their carrier slipped beneath the waves. The Battle of Midway was effectively over, but its consequences would echo across the Pacific for the remainder of the war. Dawn on June 5, 1942 revealed a Pacific Ocean transformed by 24 hours of savage combat. Where Admiral Nagumo's proud carrier fleet had steamed the previous morning, only oil, slicks, and floating debris marked the graves of Japan's naval aviation. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, rested on the ocean floor 3 miles below, taking with them over 3,000 sailors and the irreplaceable core of Japan's experienced pilots. Admiral Chester Nimitz received the first reports of American victory in his Pearl Harbor headquarters at 6:15 that morning. The same basement where cryptanalysts had broken Japanese codes now buzzed with celebration as radio messages confirmed the destruction of the enemy fleet. But Nimitz, ever the professional, knew that wars were not won by single battles. Regardless of their magnitude, the American victory came at significant cost. Yorktown, despite heroic damage control efforts, remained dead in the water and undertow by the minesweeper Vireo. Her list had been corrected and fires extinguished, but the carrier remained vulnerable to submarine attack. Admiral Fletcher's decision to keep destroyers nearby for rescue operations would prove prescient within hours. At 6:13 on June 6th, Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe's submarine, I-168, found the wounded Yorktown wallowing helplessly in the Pacific swells. Despite destroyer escorts and patrolling aircraft, the Japanese submarine managed to penetrate the protective screen and fire 4 torpedoes at the stationary carrier. 2 struck home, and a third hit the destroyer Hammond, which was alongside, providing power and assistance. Hammond broke in half and sank within minutes, her depth charges exploding as she went down and killing many sailors already in the water. Yorktown, her back finally broken by the submarine attack, rolled slowly to port and disappeared beneath the waves at dawn on June 7th. But her sacrifice had already secured American victory at Midway, and her loss could not diminish the strategic triumph achieved by American steel. The human cost of the battle reflected its decisive nature. Japan lost approximately 3,000 sailors and airmen, including many of the veteran pilots who had spearheaded the Pacific offensive since Pearl Harbor. These experienced aviators, trained over years of intensive preparation, could not be quickly replaced. American losses totaled 307 killed, including the crews of Torpedo Squadron 8 and other units that had pressed hopeless attacks with suicidal courage. Admiral Yamamoto, still aboard Yamato with his massive battle fleet, made the painful decision to abandon Operation MI and withdraw to Japanese waters. The architect of Pearl Harbor recognized that his nation's offensive capability in the Pacific had been shattered in a single day. According to historical accounts preserved in Japan's National Institute for Defense Studies, Yamamoto privately told his staff that Japan could no longer hope for victory against America's industrial might. The strategic implications of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japan's loss of 4 fleet carriers and their air groups ended any possibility of further major offensive operations in the Pacific. The initiative passed permanently to American forces, who would use their growing numerical superiority to launch the island-hopping campaign that would carry them to Tokyo Bay. For America, Midway validated the intelligence revolution that had transformed modern warfare. The codebreakers who had provided Admiral Nimitz with advance warning of Japanese intentions proved that information could be as decisive as firepower in determining battle outcomes. Their success would influence American strategy for the remainder of the war and beyond. Most importantly, the Battle of Midway demonstrated that American resolve could match any enemy in determination and exceed them in adaptability. The dive bomber pilots who had pressed their attacks through intense anti-aircraft fire, the damage control teams who had saved Yorktown twice, and the torpedo bomber crews who had sacrificed themselves to clear the sky for their comrades, all had proven that democratic societies could produce warriors equal to any totalitarian regime. As the sun set on June 7, 1942, The Pacific War entered a new phase. Japanese resolve had indeed met American steel at Midway, and steel had proven stronger. The road to Tokyo would be long and bloody, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Democracy had found its strength in the crucible of combat, and that strength would prove sufficient to the task ahead.